The images of soldiers fighting in the trenches may be considered symbolic of the Great War, yet the actual time spent fighting in battle was very small indeed. For the most part, life for Brandon lads in the front line was uneventful and boring. Soldiers regularly rotated between reserve, support and frontline trenches. Sometimes they were even billeted miles away from the fighting. The trenches of Flanders were not the only theatres of war where Brandon lads served. Many saw action on the seas of the Atlantic Ocean, the Indian Ocean, the Mediterranean and the North Sea, with both the Merchant Navy and the Royal Navy. Some lads served with the Royal Flying Corps and aided the fighting in the skies. Brandon lads were also posted far away from home and not just in the fields of France and Belgium. Gallipoli, Salonika, Baghdad, Kut al-Amara, Gaza and Jerusalem. The Suez Canal during wartime offered Great Britain's Commonwealth allies a direct route to bring men, equipment and supplies to the battlefields of Middle East and Europe. The alternative was to go south around South Africa and up the eastern coast of Africa, a journey which would have added many more weeks and increased the chance of an encounter with the German U-boats. In March 1917, the Allies, fearing the Suez Canal was threatened by the Ottoman Empire, launched a military campaign to push the enemy far away from this vital route. The nearby town of Gaza was defended by the Ottomans and the Germans, so this became the target for the Allied attack. Initially, the attack went well, with Allied troops entering the town, but they could not capitalise on those gains, and, under the threat from more Ottoman reinforcements, they withdrew. Some commentators even stated the Allies had snatched defeat from the jaws of victory. Having come so close, the Allies launched the second battle for Gaza just 3 weeks later. In that battle were men of Brandon fighting with the Norfolk Regiment. Harry Docking, Frederick Hensby, Frederick Newell, Morris Osborne, William Talbot, Frederick Wicks and George Wicks all saw action in the sands of Gaza. The Norfolk Regiment, following a day of pounding the enemy positions with artillery, began their attack at 7:30 in the morning of the 19th of April. A solitary tank led them out and they managed to take prisoners along the way, but as they reached their objective, the enemy artillery and machine guns opened up, killing or wounding 2/3 of the men. The Norfolks withdrew, and when they reached safety and regrouped, Harry Docking and Frederick Hensby did not return. Their bodies were never found. Frederick Hensby had just celebrated his 33rd birthday and left behind a widow and 4 young children. A third Brandon lad, George Wicks, did manage to return to safety, but had been so severely wounded along the way. Just the previous year he had also been severely wounded on the Somme and required hospitalisation then, but 3 days after being wounded at Gaza, he succumbed to his wounds and died. Despite the Allies throwing all they could in the attack, tanks, aircraft, vast numbers of men, even cavalry on camels, the Ottomans and their German allies repelled the attack and again reinforced the town. On the 1st of November 1917, the Allies launched a third assault on Gaza, having reinforced their own numbers over the months since the previous one. The Norfolk Regiment, again featuring our Brandon lads, were tasked with taking high ground, which they had nicknamed Gibraltar Crested Rock. The battle began in the hours of darkness. The artillery fire that was softening the enemy on the high ground also blew sand and dust down onto the advancing Norfolks, which, combined with the darkness, reduced visibility to such a poor state that many troops became disorientated. Men did make it to the high ground, but in dribs and drabs, with a Brandon lad, Frederick Wicks, being among them. However, The low numbers reaching their objective meant they were unable to fend off the enemy counterattacks, so they withdrew downhill across exposed land. Enemy artillery then inflicted heavy casualties. Fred was killed during this time. Another Brandon lad, Morris Osborne, also featured in the attack, but was never seen again once the men made their way up towards the high ground. Elsewhere, the battle went to plan, meaning the Third Battle of Gaza did see the Ottomans finally driven out of Gaza, thus providing the Allies with enough momentum to push them back towards Jerusalem. Toward the end of November, the Allies were fighting the enemy in areas around Jerusalem. The city itself did not offer much resistance, and on the 9th of December 1917, the Ottomans gave it over to the Allies. In doing so, they stated in their surrender that they were concerned for the holy sites and potential damage that might be caused by the heavy Allied guns. On the day of the surrender of Jerusalem, William Talbot died of wounds he had received in battle. Weeks of mopping up followed, with the Allies pursuing enemy elements, while those elements would often counterattack with varying degrees of success. Frederick Newell, a railway worker from Whitehorse Street, was involved in such a battle on Boxing Day, in which he received a head wound. He sadly died 2 days later. The Brandon lads serving in the trenches of the Western Front wrote home about their experiences. They wrote of visiting local French towns, meeting other Brandon lads serving in other units, and of course of struggles to get decent food and tobacco. Some even referred to new training exercises that they were involved in, such as George Collis, a saddler from Brandon, who wrote to his mother in Bury Road and described seeing men adapting to wearing their new gas protection hoods. The soldiers have been wearing life-preserving helmets and began with wearing them for half hours. And this is to be increased daily so they can be worn for 3 hours. This is to be a protection against poison, which hangs about for about 16 hours. By 1917, gas was being routinely used by the Germans, the British and the French. Different gases had different effects on the body. The green-coloured chlorine gas damaged lungs and eyes, often leading to suffocation or blindness, while mustard gas could cause skin to blister and, if inhaled, would lead to internal bleeding, often meaning the victim had a slow and painful death lasting over many weeks. In August, Hugh Bowen, the Brandon photographer, was informed that his son, also named Hugh, was recovering in a French hospital after he had been caught up in a cloud of gas. Hugh was fortunate and survived this gassing. Percy Wicks, who before the war was a hairdresser working for John Caban on Brandon's High Street, was in hospital when he wrote home about his exploits. All the time I was in France, I was at the Somme, and it is hell upon earth there. It is awful to get the orders to go, as you are all lined up in the trenches and being shelled. 8 of us had to form a bombing party, and we were stuck there until the night of the 15th, when a shell blew us out. That is when I got wounded. I got a bit of shell in the chest, the left arm and both legs, so I think I had my share. I managed to get to the field station and be roughly dressed. We then lost our way to the dressing station. It was dark and we walked about 6 miles out of the way, and at last we came to a road and asked the way to the dressing station and were told it was another 2 miles. How I managed it, I don't know. About 10 of us started from the field station and only 6 of us got to the dressing station. The others got lost over no man's land and we did not see them again. William Adams, or Bill as he was better known, was also serving on the Western Front. He was a middle-aged man, aged about 36 and a father to 3 daughters. It is unlikely that he enlisted at the beginning of the war and, most likely, was one of those men who remained working in Brandon until compelled to go into the army by the Brandon War Tribunal, chaired by Mr. William Rout. In October, his wife Jessie received a letter from a comrade of her husband, telling her that Bill had been wounded. I am very sorry to have to write to you, to tell you that poor Bill got wounded the other day when we went into action, but I do hope it is not serious. I don't think it is. We had advanced to our journey's end and started to dig ourselves in, when one poor fellow got wounded. and Bill went to fetch him, and a sniper wounded him. I hope you will have good news, and as soon as you know, let me hear. William Bill Adams was taken to a casualty clearing station manned by the Royal Army Medical Corps, but sadly died soon after. Even though the previous year's slaughter at the Somme had claimed many Brandon lives, it is in fact 1917 that we see the most deaths of Brandon lads in any single year of the war. In terms of Brandon losses, this single year, when 20 were killed, is almost as many as the whole Second World War put together. Not all men died in combat. Disease and accidents claimed a fair few too. Let's look at the demise of Lewis Halls on the 14th of November 1917. The teenager, aged 18, was newly enlisted and had undergone training as a machine gunner for the new tanks that were having an impact on the Western Front. On the 14th of November, he was travelling across the countryside of France in a packed train. It was so packed, in fact, that men were crammed into open carriages exposed to the elements. The destination was the area around Cambrai, where the tanks were to be involved in a big push a week later. The train, travelling too fast to take a tight bend, derailed and threw men out from the open carriages and onto the railway tracks. Tragically, poor Lewis was one of those and ended up under the wheels of the following carriages. The 20 killed in 1917 only includes those mentioned on Brandon's war memorial. There were many men with links to Brandon who are not mentioned, such as Arthur Royal, a stoker on board a merchant ship who, before the war, had moved to London with his wife. In 1917, Arthur's grandmother, still living in Brandon, received a letter stating he had drowned when his ship collided with another and sunk within 2 minutes. In 1917, Brandon churches held memorial services to those killed so far in the war. There was even talk of some kind of permanent memorial. However, memorials only record the suffering of the dead, not the suffering of those who survive. So what of those who did survive? 90% actually did, and most suffered physically, if not psychologically. That 90% had to return to civilian life and forget what they had seen, while dealing with everyday problems back at home. But at what cost? The cost to Percy Basham was his right arm, which was so badly damaged in a battle in 1917 that doctors amputated it below the elbow. Percy returned to civilian life and did a hard day's graft with the best of them, refusing to be that victim. In 1917, while thoughts were turning to a time when the misery of war would be gone, no one was quite sure how long this war would last, nor how many more Brandon lads were going to suffer.